L'Académie vous souhaite la bienvenue à cette conférence qui va être donnée par professeur Lisa Anderson, que je vais présenter de manière sommaire. Professeur Lisa Anderson est professeur émérite de relations internationales à la School of International and Public Affairs, SIPA, de Columbia University. Elle est membre du conseil académique consultatif de Columbia Global Center, qui est basé à Tunis. Et que Youssef Sherif représente. Professeur Lisa Anderson a été présidente de l'Université américaine du Caire pendant 5 ans, de 2011 à 2016. Avant sa nomination au poste de présidente, elle en était recteur, poste qu'elle avait occupé en 2008. Lisa Anderson est doyenne émérite de la School of International and Public Affairs de Columbia, école qu'elle a dirigée de 1997 à 2007. Lisa Anderson a rejoint Columbia University en 1986 et elle a été chef du département de sciences politiques et directrice de l'Institut du Moyen-Orient de cette même université. Elle a également enseigné aux universités de Princeton et de Harvard. Les recherches universitaires du professeur Lisa Anderson ont porté sur la formation de l'État au Moyen-Orient et en Afrique du Nord. Ils ont également porté sur le changement de régime et la démocratisation dans les pays en développement. Ils ont porté sur les sciences sociales, la recherche universitaire et les politiques publiques aux États-Unis et dans le monde. Parmi ces livres de référence figurent The State and Social Transformation in Tunisia and Libya, 1830-1980, Princeton University Press. Professeur Lisa Anderson est trustee de l'université Aga Khan et membre du conseil consultatif de la Hertie School of Governance de Berlin et de l'école des affaires publiques de Sciences Po Paris. Elle est membre émérite du conseil d'administration de Human Rights Watch, l'Organisation mondiale de défense des droits humains. Elle a été présidente de la Middle East Studies Association en 2003 et elle a été présidente du conseil d'administration du Social Science Research Council entre 1998 et 2008. Elle est membre de l'Académie américaine des arts et des sciences et du Conseil des relations extérieures de Council of Foreign Relations. Telle est la présentation rapide que je fais de notre invitée, Lisa Anderson. Nous sommes très heureux que vous veniez à notre académie. Le public est à votre écoute.
Thank you very much. I want to al-Hikma. I want to thank my other colleagues who were hosting the workshop that we participated in for the last several days at CIMET and the Columbia Global Center. It is a delight to be here in Tunis. And I want to recognize the several friends and colleagues who are here in the audience, from whom I had the great good fortune of learning over the course of my long but often interrupted association with Tunisia. I hope I redeem their work with me. Most of what I'm known for in Tunisia, in any event, is work that's really essentially historical. And today I want to talk about the contemporary scene in the region. This lecture grows out of work that I've been doing for the last 20 years or so, partly as an academic researcher and partly, as you heard, as an administrator, thinking about how institutions are developing, particularly in the Arab world. So it's more contemporary and more regional, but it does reflect some of the kinds of preoccupations that I've had for most of my academic career. So what I want to do is really reflect with you about what's changing in the Arab world, how do we understand the contemporary scene? Because I am persuaded, and I hope to persuade you, that things are changing quite dramatically in ways that many people who follow sort of contemporary politics aren't appreciating. There's a kind of deeper change in the region that I want to focus on. So there are not only new players who are increasingly important in regional politics and obviously to some degree in domestic politics, but they're framing their purposes differently. They're exercising their power in new ways. So this really goes beyond the way we've thought about politics in the region since the end of the Second World War. And I'm going to make the case that simply thinking about the polities in the region as states or the governments as regimes is not enough. We need to have another lens that we can use in understanding how government works now. This reflects, again, changes in the region and global changes. This reflects decades now of neoliberal privatization and the influence of the World Bank, the influence of the United States, the influence of Margaret Thatcher, the influence of the IMF, and the changing international economy and the growing importance of finance. I think that is changing the nature of power. And so I want to make that case to you this afternoon. So I think there are ways to understand this historically, and I am trying to, if you will, historicize the study of authority. So some of my historian self will come out here, even though I'm talking about mostly contemporary issues. So I think the primacy of the state is actually not permanent. It is a historical moment. The state was important in the middle of the 20th century. I think it is less important now. Keep in mind that the state, as we understand it now, actually was a relatively recent invention. It appeared in Europe in the middle of the 17th century. It was exported throughout the rest of the world over the course of the several following centuries, and was exported formally, became the way you participated in international politics through the United Nations, when the way you could be independent was to be a state. So stateness became very important with the United Nations. And again, we can talk about all of this, but that's the argument I want to make. And I will make also the argument that the idea of citizenship is intimately tied to the state. So if you don't have a state, you're not going to have citizens. You're going to have something else. That is the relationship between authority holders and those who are under their control. So you had a period in the region, in the Middle East and North Africa, which was really characterized by the importance of states growing, strengthening states, developing citizenship. And then, as I will argue in more detail momentarily, you had a period where authority was really not located in states so much as in the regimes, the way governments operated. Then you had a period where that too began to dissipate, weaken, for reasons having to do with the domestic scene, but also globally. You have a period of regime change, a lot of uncertainty. And here we are, and I'm going to argue that what you're beginning to see is authority being exercised by governments that characterize themselves as running businesses. And so the language, the conceptualization of responsibility, the whole stance that governments are taking is changing before our very eyes. And so that's the argument I want to present to you. So I'm going to go through this, and then again, I would love to get your reactions to it. So again, quickly, let's talk a little bit about what it looked like when the state was the organizing principle of political power. And of course, this was United Nations, independence, new countries were becoming members of the United Nations. The way you conveyed your independence and sovereignty in the international system was to be a state. And there was a lot of debate, actually, during the 50s and 60s about what shapes states would take, how much the legacy of European rule would survive. So again, keep in mind, think about the Mashriq. You had the period of the United Arab Republic. So is Egypt Egypt, or is Egypt part of the United Arab Republic? What role is Syria going to be playing in that? You had still the contestation in Algeria during this period. There was a lot of uncertainty, but a lot of commitment to the idea that the purpose was an independent state. And this was the way authority, autonomy, political power, independence, and so forth was exercised. And so we continue to see some of the legacy of this. You see layers of this continuing, but keep in mind that this was a period when a lot of contestation over the existence of Israel, whether Israel would be a state, whether Israel would be a flash in the pan and disappear, and the Palestinians would, or some Arab unit like the United Arab Republic, would control that territory. Very contested. But what the contestation was about states. During that time, states were supposed to be creating citizens. So that was through essentially taxation and conscription. So everybody in that conceptualization is a citizen within this state, pays taxes, probably has to do military service. There is extraction for the state to establish its monopoly over the legitimate use of force. That's the Weberian definition of a state, and to extract the resources to pay for that. Very simple, but very complicated, obviously. And that was what people contested about. Who would pay, who would serve, what the ruler was going to be doing with that, and so forth and so on. So what I want to argue is that that period of contestation, which is honest, and part of the reason I care about this is that I wrote about that then, about what the state formation looked like in the region. And at the time when I was writing about that, I assumed that it was essentially a permanent process of change in one direction, that states would get stronger, that they would be more solidified, that people would conceive of themselves as citizens of those states. I think I was wrong. And so part of this is a revisiting some of my own work of why it was that those states didn't become what I had expected them to become. And what happened instead, the military defeat of 1967, the independence of the Gulf states, so everybody is now independent. the rise of oil prices. A lot of things happened in the 1970s, late 60s through the 70s, that really meant that the state was no longer the priority so much as regime stability. This was partly dictated by the international system. The Cold War superpowers did not want more conflict in the region. They wanted stability, and they were willing to pay for it. So whether it was through foreign aid from superpowers or whether it was through aid from oil producers, a lot of governments began to get rents that they could use instead of collecting taxes. So you will notice, perhaps you haven't noticed, but I will tell you, that the fiscal systems in the Arab world are the weakest in the world. People in these countries do not have strong systems for collecting taxes. So you may feel like you're paying a lot of taxes, but by the standards even of sub-Saharan Africa, the fiscal systems in this region are very weak. And that's largely because the revenues of the governments don't come principally from domestic taxation. And that's been true for decades. So you have governments that find sources that permit them not to extract from their own citizens, but to distribute. So you have distributive polities now. And these governments were the funders, if you will, from outside wanted stability. And the governments arranged to secure their own stability by distributing domestically. But they didn't distribute equally to everyone. That would have been what you would expect if the citizens could make demands as citizens. Instead, while there was virtually no regime change in the region from this whole period, essentially up to the American-led change of regime in Iraq, what you did see was regimes using their access to resources to develop clienteles. So citizens was not the way. So if I want to make a demand on the government, I want a hospital in my town, I don't make that demand as a taxpaying citizen. I now begin to make that demand on the basis of some other connection that I have with the regime. So at that point, the regimes were beginning to say, okay, I'll give you that village, that town, a hospital, because you come from the ethnic group that supports me, or you come from the kinship group that supports me, or you come from the sectarian group that supports me. And increasingly, you saw regimes interacting with supporters, not as governments interacting with citizens, but as governments interacting with clienteles. So during this period, you have really quite remarkable stability because the regimes could allocate their resources across their populations in ways that favored some people and disfavored other people, but favored enough people to keep them in power. That wasn't consistent with the norms of citizenship, but it was certainly consistent with the norms of sectarianism or the norms of kinship or other kinds of mechanisms for developing ties among governments and people. Now, what was interesting about that, of course, as you're all well aware, is that those kinds of relationships, those kinds of identities, so if this now becomes identity politics, if you will, instead of citizenship politics, those kinds of identities escaped the control of many governments. So they thought, and I'll give you Sadat as a perfect example. Sadat wants to have support that's not based on citizenship in Egypt because that's too expensive. So he begins to say he's going to have open spaces for Islamists. And within a decade, he faced Islamist opposition. So his effort to use Islam as a mechanism by which to distinguish among his supporters ended up coming back to haunt him. And of course, that's why he died. But that kind of early mechanism, those uses of sectarianism that we then see break Lebanon apart, become the base of support of Syria, become part of the regime in Iraq, become part of the regime in Libya, you know, where almost everywhere you look, you see these kind of distinctions among people, that the regimes used that, and then to some extent lost control of it. So obviously in Lebanon, the regime lost control of it. The extent to which Islamist movements developed in the 70s and 80s was an indication of the fact that the regimes were beginning to lose control of this. They thought that they could control, you know, sort of Quranic study groups. In fact, that turned out to be a place where people complained about the invidiousness of the regime. In any event, you saw this sort of thing develop. So you don't see states as the mechanism by which the governments are defining their responsibilities or the citizens are making demands. As I suggested, that tactic to evade the responsibility to citizens was one that escaped the control of the governments. And these kinds of identities were effective in mobilizing opposition. But the other thing that was happening during this period is that because the regimes were playing favorites, essentially finding people who would be supporters of theirs on bases that did not have to do with their kind of formal equality as citizens, the distance between the regimes and the ordinary population was growing quite dramatically. And during this period, and I have some data if you're interested in it, the kind of indicators for social development in most of the region declined. So in a lot of the countries, literacy declined. School attendance declined. The kinds of things you would expect if you're running a state and you want citizens, you're expecting to educate them. But in fact, those kinds of policies, there was a lot of neglect because you favored some people and you neglected everybody else. So for obvious reasons, it seems to me, you get a period where there's enormous dissatisfaction on the part of many people in all of the countries of the region. Yet you still have this, what I sometimes describe as a sort of crust of stability, where regimes are saying, I'm the only game in town, I'm the only alternative you have, and so you should just be used to it. So there's a kind of familiarity and longevity and so forth. But something was beginning to change in the international system that meant that the desirability of regime stability had declined. The Cold War was over. There was a long decade or so of lead-in. After that, when the sole remaining superpower didn't know what it wanted to do, but then it decided that it would take its victory, if you will, in the Cold War and promote regime change. So there was quite a lot of talk about regime change. We called it democracy promotion, but that was essentially regime change. So the foreign support for these regimes began to dissipate somewhat. And pretty soon, with the American invasion of Iraq as the sort of classic case of foreign regime change, it was clear that the dissatisfaction on the part of many of the people who had been neglected by their governments, combined with the declining backing of international features. So Obama comes to Cairo and talks about the importance essentially of regime change. He talks about democracy, talks about human rights, so forth and so on. Not clear, as became clear later, that the Americans would support the Egyptian government if there was an uprising. So you see this system of regime control of these polities come apart. And it comes apart quite dramatically. And of course, you know better than anyone, it comes apart here first. But The reason it's so contagious is because this was a syndrome across the entire region. So the governments were taken by surprise because, of course, by then they were relatively out of touch with what their people were thinking, what they were caring about. And the first indication, the first sort of indication both of their confusion and their not having been paying attention was that they often, less here for obvious reasons, but in many other places, resorted to relying on sectarianism as the answer. In other words, you know, when there's an uprising in Bahrain, it's not about bread or freedom or dignity or anything, it's the Shia. That, you know, it's sort of labeled as this is a sectarian uprising. When in fact, sectarianism or ethnicity or kinship had virtually nothing to do with the demands across the region of these protesters. But that's how the government sort of reflexively responded because it's the way they understood their relations with their constituents. So some places you saw some years of turmoil around all of that. In some places you still see the turmoil. In Libya, they haven't figured out how they're going to sort this out of the relationships between ethnic and kinship communities and government and so forth and so on. And the popular movements, as you saw, have continued all decade. And very often the framing of that is you're going to turn into Syria, you're going to turn into Libya and so forth and so on if you don't come to support an autocratic government. So that's the background. Now I'm saying I think something new is happening in this context. So this is what I really want to describe. The model here is coming from the Gulf. But because the Gulf is so important in financing other governments in the region, it is a model that's being exported from the Gulf throughout the region. So that doesn't mean states have disappeared. It doesn't even mean regimes have disappeared. Layered on top of those are now this new conception of how governments should operate and what their responsibilities are to the people, who are no longer conceptualized as citizens and actually no longer conceptualized as clienteles, so much as they are shareholders or employees or some other kind of language. Again, this is a conception of government that echoes the decades of neoliberal rhetoric coming from the international financial institutions, coming from the United States and Europe. But you're seeing it here sort of as a homegrown, or at least Gulf-grown, way of understanding how governments can manage populations. So this, as I suggest, the turn to the market reformulates ideas, principles, and norms of citizenship and redefines the relationship between regimes and clienteles. How does that happen? So power isn't measured by how many citizens you have or how loyal they are or whether you can get them to march around on Independence Day, or the size of your clienteles and whether you have a majority ethnic group and so forth and so on. It's more about market share and profits. So how does that actually work? Well, I have a quote here that you can see above me, which I really love. And this is the kind of language that is being used routinely in the Gulf and is increasingly being encouraged elsewhere. Today's leaders are not the same as yesterday, says the ruler of Dubai. Today's leaders are the silent giants who possess money. So this is about leadership. This is about modernity. This is about the future, not politicians who make noise. The babble of politics and its messy entanglements are of little benefit to us in the Arab world. So it's a very anti-political position. It's very, we can be efficient. The private sector knows how to operate things. Let's just get rid of all of this sort of messy political confusion and begin to be modern. Now, it's not just Dubai. One of the most powerful exponents of this is the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who has been described as the CEO of Saudi Arabia, took control of Aramco, did an IPO of Aramco. This is one of the reasons why they are spending money the way they are, deeply entwined with the fabric of the global financial system as a major investor of one of their big investment funds. So the way the Saudi government is now operating has very little to do with family politics or tribal politics or the kinds of ethnic associations you have with Saudi Arabia. They're operating as a business. And the model for the energy transition that everybody talks about, what are they going to do when nobody's buying oil anymore? It's not that they're going to have invested a lot in industry in Saudi Arabia. It's that they're going to have such a large sovereign wealth fund that they can be investors and live off the profits of the investments. So all of these governments are characterizing themselves as CEOs. And that means that you're seeing privatization in a lot of different forms. So I'm going to give you one or two examples, and then again, we can talk about this more. But look at the extent to which the military establishments, which were once the state's mechanism for controlling the monopoly of the legitimate use of force in the country and serving as the defender of the state, have now been privatized. There are now multiple different forms of military establishment. There is no monopoly any longer. There's, the National Guard and the Army and the police. And Egypt has 22 different kinds of police force. And that doesn't even count the military. That's just the police. And increasingly, you see a lot of private security developing, not only the ones that I give you here. I mean, the Russian Wagner Group and the American Blackwater are famous, but a lot of gated communities have their own security. Lots of places have their own security. There isn't the kind of monopoly on the use of force that we associate with the states. And these aren't ethnic militias anymore either. They are businesses. So they're businesses as private security in the gated communities. They're businesses if you have boundaries to protect. And obviously, if you're in a situation of civil conflict, that's where you see a lot of these businesses. Okay, so the military should be, or the armed forces of various kinds, should be an indication that what I'm saying, that should be a good illustration. What the state was and its military, the regime's militias, and now you're beginning to see this completely privatized. But I'm going to argue that this is happening across the kind of government administration. Governments are not getting taxes any longer are not getting revenues from taxes. That was the state. And they're not really getting revenues from rents as much as they did when they were regimes. Now they're investing and assuming that they're going to be able to get the returns on the investment. So you see lots of governments in this part of the world now being essentially forced by the IMF to shed state-owned enterprises, sell them, and then use the profit from that to invest in other kinds of profitable operations. So it's very much this idea of the private is the engine, both of growth, but also the engine of relations among the government and the people. So you see this rhetoric of public-private partnerships. And what public-private partnerships turn out to be very often is precisely this kind of partnering with private equity funds, bringing in investors, private investors, giving them special tax deals, giving them tax holidays, special economic zones, all sorts of stuff like that, because they're bringing in the money that the government can't get as taxes from its own citizens and isn't getting as strategic rents from other governments in the world. So this is where the money's coming from. Now, the interesting thing to me, well, there are many interesting things about this. First of all, there's a lot of money in this world. So when we think about finance and the world of finance, and honestly, most historians and social scientists don't think about finance, but it would be well if we did, because this is a world that is where the money is coming from. And if you want development projects, or you want a better university, or you want good hospitals, or you want any of the kinds of things that I want in any event, they're going to be provided by private investors. So hospitals are being bought up all over the region by private investors. Private universities are being established all over the place. And that's because this is how the governments are conceiving of their responsibilities. They're supposed to be able to attract this kind of private investment, and then they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. So there's lots of data on the extent to which the money is just pouring in. So countries vary to some extent on how attractive they are to private investors. A lot of countries are trying to figure out how they are going to become more attractive to private investors. The IMF is telling countries these are the things you need to do to become more attractive to private investors, and they tend to be the classic IMF, you're going to have to devalue your currency, so forth and so on. It's a cookie cutter, but that's what the private investors actually want to see. The IMF deals these days are less about what the IMF is lending you than it's a kind of rating agency. It's a way of saying the IMF is going to say, okay, private investors, you can come in. So it's a different purpose to the IMF deals. Now, to me, what's interesting about this, as I said, is that this means that ordinary people are no longer understood as citizens, which, as I've suggested, wasn't true for a long time, but they're no longer either understood as these sort of, I can get something done because, I'm a member of the same ethnic group, or I can get something done because my extended family member can do it for me. More and more, I can get something done because I'm a shareholder, and that company is responsible to its shareholders. And shareholder rights are the way we're going to make the case that something needs to change, or someone has to be accountable to me. So what this means is citizens' rights have disappeared completely. Nobody talks about that anymore. And again, this is clearest in the Gulf. So think about the Gulf, but then realize that this is not only the Gulf. This is really something that's happening more and more across the region. So in the Gulf, it's pretty obvious that the definition of a citizen in the Gulf is somebody who is an owner. And the families of the royal families think of themselves as running family-owned businesses. And as you know, family-owned businesses are very, very common in this part of the world. So when you talk about business, there's no inconsistency to say the family's running it. So these families are running family-owned businesses, and they're doing business with other people in the other families. But that means that they're not beholden at all to citizens. And increasingly, they're not beholden to each other as family members so much as they are as the management committee of the business. And probably Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia is the best example of this, because there was clearly a sense that people before he became crown prince, that the Saudi royal family had a kind of family sense of coherence and responsibility. And what he's done is basically say, okay, princes who want to be part of the management committee of the company that I'm running are more than welcome. But that's what they're doing. They're members of the management committee. For the rest of us who aren't members of the management committee, the only kind of rights that people talk about in this context are labor rights. You don't have rights as a citizen, you have rights as an employee. And those can be quite limited, but that's where anything that approximate rights resides. So this is my favorite quote of this whole project. When Mohammed bin Salman was talking about the new city that he's developing called Neom. It's on the Red Sea near Egypt. And there are actually thousands of people who live there, but for all intents and purposes, from his point of view, nobody lives there. So he says, imagine if you could set up a city where nobody lives. And all you have to care about is whether the investors in the city are happy. Okay, so they're making investments in, this new entertainment center, and it's just incredibly, I could show you pictures of Neom. It's like Wakanda, if you can, it's just an amazingly ambitious operation. So he says, though, imagine if you were the governor of New York and you had no public. How much would you be able to create for the companies in the private sector? That's what he's doing. There isn't any public. There's no conception of public. This is a business. So if you're lucky, you're part of the management committee, you may be a shareholder, you've made some investments, maybe you're an employee, but those are the categories that you can be. And worse, for some people in this system, you may end up being a commodity. You're not even at the level of being an employee. So here are a couple of examples. The Egyptians have begun to sell citizenship by basically saying, if you put enough money in the Egyptian central bank, you can become a citizen. So they've commoditized citizenship completely. And a lot of people are essentially, the commoditization of refugees is quite dramatic in Jordan. So Jordan has been able to get a fair amount of support from the international system by saying, we're the biggest hoster of refugees in the world, and so forth. So the people who are the refugees, or the people who are the migrants across the region, feel like they're being bought and sold, that all they are is a commodity. Now, from the point of view of the businesses, fine. They don't mind commodifying us. So this is why the Abraham Accords works, because the Abraham Accords is a business deal. And it's a business deal among the business communities of Israel and the Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco. It's not getting any pushback from the international system. In fact, it's being supported in the international system because the international system is supporting this kind of neoliberal globalization. So again, I'll give you the ruler of Dubai. The time has come to get rid of leaders, to get rid of politicians, foreign ministers. Who cares about people like that? When in fact, you could have business leaders and heads of industry. Doesn't it seem, like there's energy there, there's future there, there's a kind of, this is where all of the dynamism of the economy and therefore the dynamism of everything else is. And these foreign ministers are just dragging us all down. I hope there are a couple of foreign ministers here. This is just, the language is astonishing and it's completely open. These are things they've said, they've published. This is the way they're thinking about the world. So this isn't something that's under the radar. The influence in some other countries is still fairly under the radar. It's a little bit harder to see, but certainly from the point of view of the Gulf, this is a system that works. Now, that means that there are beneficiaries, and the beneficiaries are the governments and the people who are in business with the governments. So they're no longer what states used to have to do, secure the independence of the territory and the people within it, or safeguard stability and protect the clientele. Now they're ensuring the ease of doing business. And I'm sure you've heard that rhetoric, that one of the important things that all countries these days are ranked on is ease of doing business. Is that the purpose of government? In some ways, it is becoming the purpose of government. So how much of the IMF or private investors, BlackRock, and some of the big famous private equity firms that are investing in this region, co-investing with Mohammed bin Salman's Public Vision Fund and so forth and so on, they're all looking for rankings on ease of doing business. There's, as I say, a kind of techno-optimism here. It's very Silicon Valley. It's very sort of disruption is fine. Some people will be losers, but they kind of, too bad for them. They deserve to be losers anyway. We're the dynamic, agile, flexible, 21st century, new technology types. So that sense of this is what government is about, as I said, you can see it most clearly in the Gulf. You can certainly see it in Egypt, and you see it in Egypt partly because of the influence of Gulf investment. So the more Gulf investment there is in a country, the more you're likely to see this kind of language and so forth and so on. The Gulf countries are circling around Syria as an investment opportunity, just as they did years and years ago around Lebanon as an investment. Rebuilding Lebanon, you can make a lot of money doing that. Rebuilding Syria, you're going to be able to make a lot of money doing that. So the sense of, whether there's a de-escalation in tensions is partly whether it's seen as an opportunity to make money. There are going to be people who are losers, and this is the really scary part of this story, and this is why I think it's important for everybody to be thinking about this, and this is what I want to leave us with. For the beneficiaries, it's great. But the beneficiaries are going to be a relatively small proportion of the people in the region. And for everybody else, this is not good news, in my estimation. This region of the world has now become the most inegalitarian in the world. And it used to be Latin America was famous for being unequal. The Arab world is far more unequal than Latin America now. And that's within countries as well as across the region. So you might think, well, of course, the Gulf countries, they're all rich and so forth and so on. But inequality within countries, within Egypt, within Tunisia, within everywhere, has grown dramatically. So if you're the beneficiary, you do have a gated community and the private security that supports it and access to all sorts of tax benefits for your business and so forth and so on. But if you're not, the decline in standard of living has simply increased since in the last 10 years. And as we saw, it had already begun to decline. So this is, I think it seems to me to be pretty worrisome. And I think this is why we need to be thinking about it. We need to be thinking about it as analysts and as social scientists because we're supposed to be understanding the way the world works. But I also think there's an underlying normative or political concern here that it's going to be very, very hard for people who are not within the system to make any kinds of demands, because you can't make demands as citizens. You can't make demands as co-ethnics. And now, you're not, if you're not a consumer, if you're not an employee, you have very little leverage here. So I leave you with, unfortunately, my final quote is one that I think is pretty powerful. But honestly, I could have found this about a lot of different countries. It just happens that this is a Jordanian baker, bread baker, who says the state takes and no longer gives back. It's just there to keep the powerful well fed. But one day there will be nothing for the poor to eat except the rich. And there's some very, very dystopian novels, say in Egypt, that really describe a future like this. So it's not something that no one has imagined. So, you know, it's a set of decisions that collectively we're all going to have to make about whether we think that the optimism is going to be enough to carry everyone else, or whether this is going to be a system that is actually we're not comfortable with and we're not going to live with and we're going to agitate about. Because I think there is not going to be a long time before this actually does sweep all the way through the region. On that very happy note, thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, professeur Lisa Anderson. Lisa Anderson a cette qualité qui est rare, elle en a de nombreuses. C'est l'une des plus grandes spécialistes du monde arabe. Et les études qu'elle fait ne sont pas des études pointées sur un pays, mais sur un ensemble de pays. Ces études sont comparatives dans le temps et dans l'espace. Vous avez vu que ce qu'a présenté Lisa Anderson, c'est le monde arabe depuis la deuxième moitié du XXe siècle jusqu'à ce jour et les changements qui sont en cours et qui travaillent aujourd'hui le monde arabe. Je voudrais dire que j'ai été particulièrement intéressé par cette étude, que je n'en ai pas lu d'identique ou de semblable. C'est un très beau voyage. Il nous fait visiter du monde arabe au cours des 70 dernières années et dans le monde d'aujourd'hui. L'analyse qu'elle effectue, elle est aussi extrêmement riche parce qu'elle historise les pays du monde arabe. Et elle voit des phases historiques. Elle en fait émerger 4, 50, 75. C'est l'État qui est fort, qui, à la limite, crée les citoyens. Et en l'écoutant, je pensais à la Tunisie. J'essayais de voir si le découpage qu'elle faisait s'appliquait peu ou prou à la Tunisie, alors que son objectif, c'est d'étudier l'ensemble du monde arabe. On retrouve un peu la Tunisie, 50-75. C'est vrai que l'État est un État fort et que l'État crée le citoyen. 1975, 2000, il y a un changement. On va vers une certaine privatisation. Le régime fait de la clientèle. J'ai retrouvé Zine Abidine Ben Ali, la clientélisation de la société. Bon, mais le propos de Lisa Anderson n'était pas la Tunisie. Mais si je veux bien aussi essayer de chercher la Tunisie, je m'y retrouve aussi un peu, bien que ce soit un tout petit pays que la Tunisie. Les années 2020, c'est le changement. C'est une politique de clientèle. L'État n'est plus au service des citoyens, il est au service et il crée une clientèle. Et il y a une fragmentation de la population. Les identités ne sont plus nationales, elles sont de plus en plus ethniques, sectaires. Et on assiste aussi à ce moment-là aux révoltes dans le monde arabe. Partout, 2020, c'est ce qui se passe. 2020 à ce jour, c'est restauration et renouveau. La politique n'est plus au service des citoyens, ni même au service d'une clientèle, c'est du management, c'est de la gestion. Alors, j'aurais beaucoup de questions à vous poser, Lisa. Mais on voit bien que ce qui guide le monde depuis quelques décennies, les 2 dernières décennies, c'est les pays du Golfe. C'est la rente pétrolière qui devient le levier de la force qui change le monde arabe. Et une concentration des richesses, Le pouvoir devient un pouvoir de management, de gestion. C'est la magie du marché. Les leaders des monarchies pétrolières ne sont pas simplement des rentiers. Ils deviennent des politiques qui façonnent l'image du monde arabe et qui sont la force principale, non seulement à l'échelle de la région, mais même à l'échelle du monde. Parmi les compagnies les plus riches du monde, les 50 plus riches, il y en a 12 qui sont des pays du Golfe. Ben Salman et Mohammed al-Maktoum deviennent à la fois des chefs d'État, elle n'a pas prononcé le mot État, des chefs, des CEO, c'est-à-dire des PDG de monarchie. Le poids, la force ne vient plus de l'importance de la population, de la culture, de la richesse, de l'histoire, elle vient du capital qu'ils détiennent. L'économie, les pays, les États arabes sont des États d'associés qui ont ou qui dominent des fonds souverains. Et les fonds souverains sont parmi les plus importants du monde. Cette mutation était-elle imaginable il y a de cela 40 ans? Inimaginable. Donc le pouvoir change et le centre du monde gravite autour d'États que nous pensions des États entiers, fondés sur des tribus. Et voilà que ces pays tribaux émergent comme puissance qui façonne aujourd'hui le monde. Merci, Lisa. C'est fabuleux, les mutations que vous venez de décrire. Maintenant, j'ai un certain nombre de questions à vous poser. Ces mutations, ce n'est pas seulement la rente pétrolière qui est derrière. Qu'est-ce qui se passe aujourd'hui dans le monde? What are the driving forces behind this move? Quelles sont les forces qui expliquent ces changements? Il y a bien quelque chose. Ces changements ne tombent pas du ciel, elles émergent de forces qui sont derrière. Le monde est en train de changer. Il y a des forces qui guident ce processus. Quelles sont-elles? Deuxièmement, le monde a été façonné. Le point de départ que vous prenez, le début de la deuxième moitié du XXe siècle, c'est un monde bipolaire, mais qui va devenir un monde monopolaire, unipolaire. Le monde que vous décrivez de la deuxième moitié des années du XXe siècle est un monde guidé par les États-Unis. L'ordre mondial est un ordre qui a été façonné au lendemain de la Seconde Guerre mondiale par l'ordre américain. Où sont les États-Unis? Je ne fais que commencer, permettez-moi. Il fallait bien démarrer tout à l'heure et dès maintenant, selon ce que vous voudrez, soit vous répondez maintenant à mes petites interrogations, soit on entend encore des questions. C'est à vous de choisir. Okay, thank you.
First of all, I think I'll take the second question. Where's the United States? What's the role of the United States? And I think the United States is going through its own crisis, as you can probably see even from here. Since the invasion of Iraq, every subsequent administration has said that they wanted to withdraw from involvement in this region, pivot to China. Other things were important. Trump called the Middle East a quagmire, which is not a compliment. But before that, Biden had said that he wanted to withdraw. They were going to withdraw from Syria, Afghanistan, so forth, Iraq. All of those problems are, from the American point of view, problems. So the United States just doesn't want to have the kind of role that it had. So during the Cold War, the United States was perfectly happy with this competitive environment, which it thought it was doing pretty well, stability. It had its friends, Soviet Union had their friends. This was okay. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. There was American triumphalism for, I would say, about 15 years. That because the United States had won, the whole world would realize that democracy was better and would just everybody become democratic. And there was very little imagination beyond that kind of thinking in Washington. The Iraq War really was an existential crisis for the United States because it was such a catastrophe. It didn't produce democracy, obviously. It produced a humanitarian disaster, although the United States doesn't like to characterize that way. It is, in fact, the case, and the policymakers know it. Afghanistan was a disaster. So the United States really just wants not to do this sort of stuff anymore, but doesn't have a positive vision of the future in foreign policy terms. So, and in fact, I published a review article in the Foreign Affairs magazine about the grand delusion of American policy in the Middle East. And right now, there is no policy in the Middle East. There's just they use language because they have to say things. So they talk about the importance of stability and prosperity and harmony. And it's just nothing. There's nothing there. The United States, and there are two elements to that, one of which is this has been a catastrophe. The United States is now obviously worried about Russia and China's revival or some kind of conflictual relationship with Russia and China. And frankly, the United States is having its own domestic crises, which are very preoccupying. So, as we speak, it does look like Trump and Biden will run again. And it's not altogether clear that Trump could not prevail. So this is what Americans are thinking about. They're not actually thinking much about the rest of the world. And the difference between a Biden administration and a Trump administration in terms of global policy is going to be quite significant. So you can't predict. So how would any of the governments of the world navigate an American policy when you don't know whether it's going to be Biden or Trump? Trump is clearly an enthusiast of this kind of private, transactional, this is the governments he likes. It's the way he thinks of his role in the United States. So he sort of embodies a lot of this, using the government for business purposes. Fine with him. It's what he's doing. So if he is in fact reelected, you will see more of this and more of a permissive environment, if you will, globally under Trump. So I think the United States is actually very hard to read, very hard to predict. So I sympathize with all of the people in the rest of the world who are trying to manage some kind of relationship with the United States. It's just even more difficult than usual. So I think that's where the United States is. The other thing is, in terms of the United States, although Trump is the obvious example of this, both Obama and Biden did a fair amount of delegating to the private sector a lot, so they're perfectly happy to have the ease of doing business for American business be a priority. So even if Biden is reelected, I think you're not going to see a real pushback on this. This is essentially okay with the United States. So that's the American picture. So why is it that this sort of what we've seen for a long time, that kind of neoliberal globalization that started in the 1990s, and why does it seem to be so accelerated and so powerful now? I think what we don't appreciate, and this is why I would recommend to all of my social sciencey colleagues that they take some economics, is that the world of global finance has been so enhanced, accelerated, and so forth by the new information technologies. It's so easy now to do global investing, to get the data you want, to do it instantaneously, to do currency swaps and credits, hedges, and all, the kinds of things that the investors are looking for, that it has become a very, very significant part of the global economy. And we, I have to say, this is partly generational, tend to think of global economics in terms of trade. This isn't trade, this is finance. And finance, thanks to these technologies, has become very, very powerful. And that's something that the Gulf rulers have figured out. So it's not just that they have a lot of money. They could be saying, okay, the energy transition, what we're going to do is we're going to invest in industrialization in Saudi Arabia, and we're going to make something that we will export to the world. That's okay. I mean, that's what most people think when they talk about an energy transition, that's what they're doing. But that's not what they're doing. They're saying we're going to invest our money. The biggest sovereign wealth fund in the world is the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund. What do they do with it? They invest, co-invest with private investors and make even more money. And then they're going to have an even bigger private sovereign wealth fund. That's how they're thinking about this transition. So it's, yes, at the moment, you still see oil rents, but that's not how they're conceptualizing it. They're seeing it as money that they can lend to people, make money, so forth and so on. So I think we collectively need to be, even if we're not going to be financiers, the people who understand this are the people who are working in the field. And all the rest of us never took those courses because we didn't think we were interested. But now, if we don't take those courses, if we don't start thinking about the role of finance, we are leaving it to the people in the business. So that's, to me, the answer. It is just a much, much larger part of the economy of the world.
Thank you very much. La parole est à ceux qui la veulent. Je vais prendre une liste de 4 ou 5 personnes comme premier jet. Madame, monsieur, madame, madame. C'est Hamadi. Ça fait 6. Bon, je vais commencer ici avec une liste de 6.
Merci bien. Thank you very much, Professor Anderson, for this courageous analysis of the situation. You reminded me of Condoleezza Rice's theory, the creative chaos, as you remember. I think it all started with this creative chaos. It was actually meant for the Middle East, but I think it is now being applied to the whole world, not only the Middle East or the Gulf region. My question is, based on your knowledge of the region, do you think this transition, allow me to call it transition, or evolution from the state of citizens to the state of commodities will also apply to North Africa, given the current situation we are living in countries like Tunisia or Morocco, no, not Morocco, Libya and Sudan recently, and Egypt, of course. And my other question is, what is your take on the political transition or democratization transition in our country, since you are visiting our country? Do you think democratization is, at the end of the day, becoming a real hoax, which is quite costly for the region and for our country as well? I'd like to have your take on this. Thank you.
Merci à vous, Monsieur le Président. Bonjour, Madame Lisa Anderson. Je suis journaliste Fatma Karaï. Nous avions eu une entrevue peut-être 30 ans avant aux États-Unis. J'étais avec vous, une journaliste qui vous posait quelques questions et vous m'avez donné une idée force que vous avez défendue, justement, me disant que vous, les arabo-musulmans, vous n'avez pas de... vous n'avez rien avec la démocratie, vous n'avez pas ça dans votre histoire ni dans votre patrimoine. Et nous avions eu une discussion quand même, là où je me défendais devant vous, une experte en sciences politiques et aussi en sciences sociales. Et je vous ai dit que la démocratie libérale n'est que 2 siècles avant, etc. Et on a eu ça. Bon, maintenant, vous êtes en Tunisie, vous êtes la bienvenue. Vous m'avez dit aussi en 90, mars 90, cette interview, vous m'avez dit que je viens beaucoup en Tunisie et quelques pays arabes et je confère avec quelques leaders d'opinion en Tunisie, etc. Voilà. Vous avez dit dans votre discours maintenant, un peu dans la fin, que monsieur le président américain qui était au Caire, Obama, il a exigé la démocratie. Or, vous savez, madame, en tant qu'experte et chercheuse, que la démocratie ne se commande pas de l'extérieur, mais ça émane de l'intérieur avec beaucoup de paramètres que vous connaissez. Maintenant, nous avons subi, nous, en Tunisie, au Caire et aussi dans quelques pays, une vague de l'islam politique que vous avez dit concernant l'islam, qu'ils n'ont pas l'orientation démocratique, etc. Comment vous avez perçu cette vague, cette décennie, là où l'islam politique qui débarque subitement, qui n'a pas de programme, qui n'a pas de ligne politique démocratique claire, ni d'institution, ni l'État aussi, dont vous avez parlé maintenant beaucoup sur l'État de droit et l'État de tribu. Donc, comment vous avez vu ça avec un soutien remarquable de l'administration de M. Obama? Merci.
Oui, j'ai monsieur, ensuite vous.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Abdeltif Othmani, je suis chercheur multidisciplinaire. Je suis très heureux que vous soyez parmi nous. J'attendais cette occasion depuis belle lurette. Chère Madame, il est évident aujourd'hui que la question financière est une question qui représente la colonne vertébrale du monde. Et je crois à ma connaissance qu'on ne fait pas attention à cela. J'ai déjà publié en 2017 un livre qui s'intitule « Quand la géofinance supplante la géopolitique ». Et j'étais déjà très clair. J'ai abordé la question financière sur une période de 8 siècles et demi sur la finance. J'en ai découvert les choses suivantes et je vais être bref et vous m'en excusez. D'abord,
si vous voulez bien.
Vite fait. S'il vous plaît.
Il ne s'agit pas de résumer votre travail.
Non, ce n'est pas mon travail. Je parle de la question financière qu'elle a évoquée.
Mais essayez de centrer sur la question.
Oui, exactement. C'est sur ce terme, c'est sur ce thème que je vais essayer de développer ma petite intervention. Excusez-moi, je suis désolé. Madame, la finance a déjà commencé avec, aux États-Unis, en 1913. Donc, la Banque centrale n'est plus une banque qui est gouvernée par le Congrès américain, mais elle est décidée par les banques privées. Donc, ce que je constate aujourd'hui, que l'économie réelle que vous avez évoquée ne représente à l'échelle planétaire que uniquement 2%, alors que l'économie excusez-moi, non, c'est pas l'économie rentière, c'est l'autre économie de la spéculation. Merci. L'économie de la spéculation représente déjà 98%. l'argent qui est en circulation à l'échelle planétaire est actuellement aux alentours de 800 000 milliards de dollars. Il n'y a que 2% qui touchent à l'économie réelle du monde. Donc la question est-ce que les financiers vont essayer d'apporter des réponses économiques pour ce monde ou les seules réponses économiques vont toucher uniquement la spéculation?
Merci beaucoup.
Voilà.
Yaïch, merci beaucoup. Madame?
Merci beaucoup. Thanks, Professor, for this interesting view. It is really so worrisome and yeah, it's so scary. I have a comment and a question. I think that we are seeing the same trend, this business seeking in Russia also. Russia also is doing business, is doing the war business, is doing business in petroleum, and even in military terms with their Wagner. Now we have private groups who are fighting instead of military governmental groups. And this, I think, gives what's happening in Sudan now. We are seeing this rivalry between these interest groups who are seeking interests and other groups who are trying to survive and protecting their countries. We are seeing the same trend in Libya also. And what about Tunisia? We are a small country. We can't attract so much business. We don't have any natural resources, maybe except our strategic position. So what should we do?
Merci. J'ai avant, c'est Hamad et Samoud, quelqu'un. Oui, c'était vous, monsieur. L'année. Fadl.
Thank you so much for this insightful presentation about the history of the state in the Arab world. My question is the following. So far, with all the changes and mutations that the state has experienced in the Arab world, the ruler is the same, despite the changes. Once he was the protector of the ethnicity or religion or nationality, and once he jumped to be a CAO. To what extent does this reflect the erosion of the classical notion of Waltz's definition of the state as the key international player and actor? One. My second brief question, how can you explain the rulers in the Gulf states using money to spread their model of state or their autocracy elsewhere? Thank you.
Merci. C'est Hamadi Samoud. Ensuite, je vous donnerai la parole. Ce sera la fin de ce premier jet. C'est Hamadi Marhaba.
اسمحوا لي أولاً أن أقول للسيدة ليزا أنني مسرور جداً بلقائها بعد زمن طويل جداً. وثانياً أريد أن أتوجه لأنفسنا نحن كتونسيين. هذا الذي استمعنا إليه والذي وصفه سي محمود بأنه فابولو، وفعلاً كان عرضاً أرجو أنني فهمت أغلبه، كان عرضاً جيداً، كان عرضاً عميقاً. هذا لم يأتي من لا شيء. أمامي، اسمحي لي عزيزتي، أمامي رسالة كتبتها إلي السيدة ليزا في 76 تقول لي، وهي تتأسف أو تأسف لتأخري في الكتابة، تقول لي: أنا آسفة لهذا التأخير في المكاتبة، كنت في شغل بتعلم السياسة العربية وبالإعداد لامتحانات الدكتوراه سنة 76. إذن مع جديتها من شبابها الأول الذي عرفته فيها في معهد بورقيبة للغات الحية في تونس. سؤالي الآن البسيط: هل يا ليزا وأنت ذات النظر الثاقب كما عهدتك، هل في هذا النظام المخيف، لأن هذا الذي وقع رسمه لنا مخيف فعلا على جميع الأصعدة، أرأيت فيه بعض ثقوب الوهن أو بعض ثقوب الضعف الذي يمكن أن يقص لنا لتنتكول هذا متاع الأخطبوط، يعني أصابع الأخطبوط الذي يعني أحاط بكل شيء؟ شكرا.
أستاذ سمود بارك الله فيك على السؤال الوجيه والقصير. تفضل. Vous êtes le dernier intervenant. Madame Lisa Anderson va répondre à ce premier jet. Ensuite, on verra.
Thanks, Professor, for this fascinating talk. I have one question, briefly. How can you explain the paradox between the West and the Middle East? In the West, in the land of capitalism, we talk now, we talk of ESG, we talk of stakeholder instead of shareholder, we talk of a sense of purpose in capitalism. We talk also of woke capitalism and reimagine and fix capitalism in US, in UK, in many countries. Ironically, in the Middle East, with the poor country, the major is the poor country, we talk shareholder, not citizenship. How can you explain this vision between and this vision between these two places in the world? And thanks you.
Merci beaucoup. C'est à vous.
Well, I have to start with Ustaz Hamedi and his question because I should be answering in Arabic. And I apologize for that. I do think, I mean, let me answer your substantive question as well. I do think that there are intrinsic weaknesses in these kinds of regimes. And I think the more that model is adopted and adapted outside of the small population, large revenue countries, the more difficult it will be to actually manage. What I'm is, you know, you can imagine some of these countries becoming very large business enterprises. One of the things I do with my students sometimes is say, you know, compare the number of employees, the revenues, the real estate controlled and so forth and so on of Qatar, the UAE, and Walmart. It's the same. So there are some very big businesses, global businesses that can run this way. So that could happen. It doesn't work as well when you actually do try and take it to Egypt, where you have 100 million people who are not going to be part of the system. So I think there will be limits to it, but what concerns me is that the cost of finding those limits is going to be very high. And that's what I worry about. And so to simply say that, to share in the optimism, if you will, that these governments express. And this gets to one of the other questions, actually, about explaining how they use their money to export their model of government. Everybody does that. The United States did that for years. Soviet Union did that. They're going to do that. So what we need to be careful with is to say, we'll take what we want, but we're not going to take it all. We don't think the model makes sense outside where it's being deployed now. And that's going to be very hard because they are investing. They're investing here, they're investing in Egypt. And if they're saying, as you know, again, look at what relatively wealthy countries have done for as long as any of us have been here. They've said, this is coming with a whole cultural baggage. We're, you know, the leader of the free world, where whatever we are, we're exporting international communism, so forth and so on. So if you want our support, you have to behave the way we want you to. That's what's worrisome about it, because a lot of countries could use some investment. But it can't be tied in this way, or at least insofar as it is tied in this way, people need to be alert to the costs and benefits of that, and not simply say, it seems to work in other places, it's going to work here. So I think those two questions are sort of tied together, it seems to me. I would, you know, I guess to get to the last question about the difference between shareholders and stakeholders, and the United States and its allies have been doing a lot of, my umbrella is democracy promotion and talking about stakeholders and so forth and so on. First of all, the United States is not doing that anymore. They may talk a little bit about it and so, but they don't care. We, I guess, don't really care about it anymore. It was, and this gets back to Obama and Egypt, and you know, that one of the problems the United States faced in democracy promotion is the relatively few times when countries actually had elections at the urging of the United States, they produced anti-American governments. And that was a shock. So the United States doesn't like the elections anymore because they want the governments to be easy. So just as with being careful about the institutional and rhetorical things that come along with money, in the case of Gulf money, you have to be careful about that in the case of American money or any other money, because all of them are going to be bringing these models with them and saying, you know, this works at home. We think it's wonderful. You should do it too. If you want our money, you should, you know, we want, it isn't different to me. But I think what's happened right now is the relative weight, power in the world of the Gulf countries is higher than it has been ever before, because of course they have more money than they ever had before, but also because the United States is declining. So one of you asked something about the erosion of the state. Yes, absolutely. This is the erosion of the state. So it's both the erosion of the United States as a powerful player in the world, but it's also the erosion of the state exemplified by the United Nations and this sort of conceptual commitment to state and citizen and so forth and so on. Nobody's making that case. And honestly, I mean, again, think about sort of world history. When the Soviet Union was at its zenith, we talked a lot about the proletariat. When's the last time you heard anybody talk about the proletariat? So when the United States was at its zenith, we talked a lot about democracy and citizenship and human rights and so forth and so on. There's no reason that can't just be, that won't just disappear in the same way that much of what we associate with international communism and political economy like that and so forth and so on. So I don't think these things are permanent features of world society. They come and go. And I think that's what I'm trying to argue here, is that I think we are at a moment when the kinds of things we assume, just because we look at the map and there are all these borders and these things seem like states and they all have flags and they all have seats at the United Nations, there must be sovereignty. There isn't sovereignty anymore. Most of these states are so penetrated, it's a conceptual mistake to continue to use that frame of reference to try and understand how they operate. I mean, again, to use the Gulf because it's so obvious, most of these royal families have intermarried with other royal families across the region. So the Jordanian royal family and the Moroccan royal family and the Emirati royal families and so forth and so on, the Bahraini royal family, they're all, you know, it's like the European aristocracy of the 18th and 19th century. And those people did not think that they were governments of states. So I think, we tend to see what we look for. And I'm trying to say, I think we ought to be open to seeing other things because this is a significant transition. So you have to be open to seeing, one, the decline of the power of the United States, full stop. That means that the power of other contenders for conceptualizing politics is going to be greater. That doesn't mean they're going to win, but it does mean that there is going to be different ways of, and it's going to come with money, because it always comes with money. So that's kind of the argument I'm making. What should Tunisia do? Tunisia should be very careful. I mean, as I said, the thing is, right now you're in the middle of a dust-up with the IMF. There's a case to be made to see if you can figure out how not to get a deal with the IMF. Because that deal is part of the rating agency mechanism that will then bring all this other foreign investment. So on one hand, you say, well, what are we going to do without any foreign investment? Okay, do a deal with the IMF, be open to foreign investment, but know what's going to come along with it. What's going to come along with it is a lot of, and it is speculative. So a lot of it is you're making money out of money. And that's what debt is. So you buy something, you basically make it profitable by making it less expensive to run. You load it up with debt. You take your profit out of it. It's stuck being inefficient and debt-ridden. This is called, some of the biggest firms in the United States this has happened to, and it's happened to Sri Lanka, and it happened to Argentina years ago. This can happen to states or not states, whatever we're calling them. So that's what I mean. I think all of these things are not simple. And if people continue to contest about electoral systems, instead of contesting about the political economy and how that's going to be regulated, then the financiers are going to come in and they're going to buy up the cheap stuff and they're going to make money on it and they're going to leave and buy up cheap stuff in some other country, and they're not in for the long run. They're not about development. They're not about industrialization. They're about making money. And, they'll make the case that they can do well by doing good, and sometimes they do. But there's no guarantee of that. So I do think that this is something that this is what should be in the newspapers. This is what the debate should be about, or at least a big part of what the debate should be about in Tunisia. So I don't think, for a variety of reasons, as well as that, I don't think Tunisia is going to end up looking like Sudan or Libya or, it's just, I think this is a relatively strong, coherent place. So that's not I don't worry about that. But I do worry about being vulnerable to this kind of financial speculation that is going to come in and irresponsibly use this as an opportunity to make money. And that's what investment firms do. That's what their shareholders want. So that's what I would be thinking about if I were sitting here saying, these are the things to be paying attention to. I think that's it.
Thank you. Acceptez-vous un autre...
Another round?
Yes.
Sure.
You? Monsieur? شكون تفضل؟ شكون طالب الكلمة؟ عندي une personne, deux. Oui, نسيتك أنت. نسيتك سامح باش نبدا بك. Oui.
Elle n'a pas voulu répondre. Parce que c'est une réponse, la non-réponse.
J'ai trois demandes. عندي ثلاثة طلبات. عندي غاديكا، عندي أنت، باش نبدا بك أنت، سامحني خاطر كنت قبيليك، باش نبدا بك، ومن بعد السيد غاديكا، ومن بعد أنت ثلاثة. بون، ثم ثلاثة مداخلات، تفضل. لا سامحني باش نبدا لهنا، على إذنك خاطر هو من قبيليك، تفضل سامحني. She said that you haven't answered her question.
Bien, je tiens à remercier la conférencière parce qu'elle a découvert un champ paradigmatique auquel nous ne sommes pas très habitués dans nos rencontres d'intellectuels et même d'économistes. Mais j'ai quelques questions à poser. Entre autres, curieusement, elle intègre l'Afrique du Nord, qu'elle appelle Afrique du Nord, dans l'entité du Golfe. Pays arabes sont nommés l'Afrique du Nord, le Maghreb arabe. Est-ce que cela a une dimension signifiante en soi ou est-ce que c'est un choix délibéré? Deuxième question. Votre discours est un discours qui, d'après moi, ou tente d'être d'une objectivité sublime, ou essaye d'être un discours lithotique, voire euphémique, qui évite d'appeler un chat quand on a affaire à des États qui sont au fait des gestionnaires de leurs propres intérêts et non des États qui sont mis au service du peuple, susceptibles de former, d'encadrer, de donner naissance à travers l'école, qui est l'institution fondamentale dans toute pédagogie politique, entre guillemets, dont l'objectif premier est la construction du citoyen. On a affaire donc à des États voyous. Je n'utilise pas donc une formulation lithotique. J'appelle ces États-là des États voyous, ou est-ce qu'il s'agit réellement d'une forme de pression des forces internationales qui maîtrisent donc l'économie mondiale et qui imposent à tous les pays donc de se conformer à une certaine politique qui va à l'encontre de l'intérêt du peuple? Merci.
Thank you for your interesting presentation. Actually, I have a comment and two questions. My first comment is regarding the role of the state in the Arab world. I'm not expert in the Arab world, but since I'm from Tunisia, I know the local context. And it seems that there is a problem when we talk about the role of the state. I think that we have a problem of, I'm talking here about policymaker. There is some sort of fear and panic, and we don't know where power is laid. Is it in the policymaker or there are other actors? We remember, it is important to remind the audience here about the first government after the independence, when the leader of the UGTT, Ahmed bin Saleh, he was nicknamed at that time as the minister of everything. Okay, so at the time, the elite wanted, and Bourguiba at the time wanted to please the powerful UGTT. And yeah, that's why it was a question of pleasing everybody. And he was also known as the Mujahid Akbar. And I have a reservation here on the, you talked about the identity politics. This is my first question. When you talked about the identity politics and the emergence or the upsurge of identity politics after the Arab Spring, but I think that the politics was used, it dates back to the just after the independence, and all politicians and policymakers before the revolution and after the revolution, they instrumentalized, the identity politics and religion, and they use and instrumentalized the power of the UGTT. My second question is, my second and last question is, you classified the historical phases into 4, but I'm going to stop the second phase. You between 1975 and 2000, you know that in the 1975, it marked the emergence of the new right, and its influence the whole world drifted to the right with Reagan and Thatcher and their influence on the Arab world and North Africa. Don't you think that we have here the same context? Mainly after the Ukraine crisis, do you think that where we are drifting, is it to the right and the left? And thank you very much.
See?
Hi, thank you, Professor Anderson. Many thanks for your insightful presentation. So if states are businesses, you introduce the CEOs, the shareholders, the employees, and even the commodities, who are the clients. And often scholars from the region or scholars working on the region struggle with the definition of what state is and are dependent on Western definitions. From what I heard, you told us about what the state is doing, for example, business, but not what it is, or if the essence of the state is still something relevant to try to define. And thank you.
طلبت منك تنجمش لفاطمة تعاود السؤال متاعك.
Madame Lisa Anderson, depuis 33 ans, on s'est rencontrés aux États-Unis. C'était une entrevue et pas une interview. En tout cas, vous m'avez donné une idée phare, que je considère phare, force plutôt. Vous aviez dit que vous, en me concernant en tant qu'arabe musulman, vous, les arabes musulmans, vous n'avez pas dans votre histoire ni dans votre patrimoine chose qui s'appelle démocratie. Donc, vous ne connaissez pas la démocratie, il faut l'apprendre, etc. Au cours de vos propos maintenant, vous avez dit que M. Obama, président de la République, président des États-Unis, quand il était au Caire un 4 juin, je ne sais pas quelle année, début de son mandat, il a exigé la démocratie. Je vous ai dit que la démocratie ne s'exige pas, ce n'est pas de l'importation, mais c'est quelque chose qui émane des institutions et des formations politiques. Justement, je vous ai posé la question, comment vous avez perçu ou vu la dernière décennie qui a connu je ne sais pas, invasion ou importation ou quelque chose comme ça. En tout cas, dans notre pays, Tunisie, c'était un peu étrange. En Égypte aussi, l'islam politique, que vous-même, vous aviez dit que l'islam politique ne peut pas, l'islam et la démocratie ne marchent pas ensemble. Et puis, ça a été soutenu fortement par l'administration Obama et l'administration des démocrates, au fait. Merci.
Well, there were 4 questioners, but a lot of them had more than one question. So let me start with the Obama. First of all, I've never argued that Islam and democracy are or are not compatible. As far as I'm concerned, democracy is in principle compatible with anything. And that was originally Obama's position. He was a Democrat with a small d, as well as a member of the Democratic Party. And he was,
It was not in 1990. Please.
Obama was in Cairo in 2009. So he was arguing that democracy was a good thing and would, be good for everybody here and so forth and so on. Once Mubarak stepped down, and you saw in Egypt, you saw the American administration, Obama's administration, torn between a principled commitment to democratic elections and a concern that the government that would be produced would not be friendly to the United States. And that happened. And that was one of the examples that I meant when I said, when Americans have been willing to entertain genuinely free and fair elections, they've typically regretted it. So Obama walked away from that commitment. And it's pretty clear that the United States was willing to see Morsi turned out of office. They didn't do it, but they knew it was going to happen, and they didn't do anything about it. So to me, this is part of the dilemma of American approaches to democracy, because there are, and this region, and I mean this region including North Africa, and so this region has presented that problem more than other parts of the world. But whenever free and fair elections produce anti-American governments, the United States is unhappy and perfectly willing to back away from the commitment to free and fair elections. So we've seen that over and over. I don't think that will change, except that I don't think the United States is going to do much democracy promotion anymore. I just don't think that's on the agenda. I don't think we care. It's too hard. We're worried about other things, so forth and so on. So whatever interest there was in American politics in the past, after the end of the Cold War, 1990, there was a lot of enthusiasm, so forth and so on. It's finished. So that's another thing to just keep in mind. There's not the kind of wind at your back for democracy that there was after the end of the Cold War and after the brief experiment with the uprisings. On the Ahmed Ben Salah and the UJTT, I think you're right. But this was that period was a really, that was when we were doing states and you could be a policymaker for everybody. And that was what that meant. Nobody does that anymore because it's just hard to imagine making policy across citizens in a way that was conceivable then. I do think the syndicate was in a way instrumentalized, has been instrumentalized. So I agree with that, but I'm not sure exactly what that means now. So I don't want to speculate too much about that. I do think that one of the interesting things about the labor movements in the region as a whole is that they have become, insofar as there are some, and obviously Tunisia is an outlier in this, much stronger here than most places. But again, if you look at Egypt, this is a labor aristocracy. These are people who are as much interested in their own interests now than in actually enhancing the status of workers across the economy. So that creates a little bit of a problem in understanding interests. I didn't say that identity politics only developed after the Arab Spring. In fact, I think identity politics started much earlier than that. Governments were creating invidious distinctions among citizens on the basis of identity politics very early. And I do think that didn't have to be sectarian, so you're right, it could well be. I mean, one of the examples that I've always thought was sort of amusing was the extent to which the Algerian government has used being a veteran of the independence war as an identity. And if you carry that card, you get special benefits and so forth and so on. So there are a lot of ways you can define identity. It doesn't have to be ascriptive, sectarian and so forth. So I think that's certainly something that is a little bit different in North Africa than in the Arab East. What's going on right now? Yes, I think that, there was a shift, as someone said, it's a shift to the right. And this was Thatcher and Reagan and the beginning of the neoliberal magic in the marketplace and so forth and so on. And all of that happened. I do think we're in the middle of a period that we are going to see a shift. It's a little hard to tell globally what that's going to look like, but my view is that was a sort of left-right spectrum. And what I think is interesting now is that it's almost up and down. That is to say, if we don't look at what the wealthy of the world are doing, read Thomas Piketty. This is a time of incredible inequality around the world. And if we don't pay attention to that, and what the wealthy are doing and how they're thinking about whatever responsibilities they have to all of us who are ordinary, then I think we're missing what this transition is meaning. So it's not left and right anymore. It's not ideological anymore. It's who has the money and who doesn't. And what do you do with the money you have? And if what your purpose in having money is make more money, then you're going to approach lots of people who don't have money in a particular way that is not necessarily in their interest. They're not going to make you money, so you're not going to make the investment. You're going to put your money where you can make more money. And again, I think that's so I'd like us to be thinking about the importance of inequality. That's really and that there's a rhetoric and an ideology that justifies inequality. And this is what it is. And I think that's what our problem is. So if there's a way to talk about inequality in a different way, not talk about how wonderful it is to be doing everything as if it was a business, I think we would collectively be better served than that. Right now, that's where the kind of imagination is. The imaginative people who are designing this new system are the people who are already rich and planning to get richer. And there's sort of a dearth of imagination among the rest of us. And I think I would like to see more of that. And finally, this question of what is a state? Part of what I'm trying to argue is, there's some American kind of oldish literature now on the state is basically what you make it. And I think we've been assuming the reality and permanence of states for a very long time, and that's just a mistake. It's just a mistake. They come and go. Empires come and go. Tribes, all sorts of ways that human communities have designed to organize themselves can serve purposes at particular times in world history and then not serve purposes at particular times in world history. And just because all of us have known nothing else but states doesn't mean that they're permanent features of the world. So I think we need to be more agile. That's being imaginative too. Be more agile in the way we conceptualize where power lies, who exercises power, what mechanisms they have to exercise power. And it's not necessarily going to be the public administration.
Je crois que vos applaudissements sont l'expression d'un remerciement et de félicitations à Lisa Anderson. Merci beaucoup.